I was 18, standing dead silent right in the middle of our family dining room, my arms hanging limp at my sides, staring blankly as my own mother used her veiny hands to rip my full-ride acceptance letter to the prestigious Massachusetts Institute of Technology into 4 jagged pieces, and then casually drop those shattered fragments onto the scratched oak dining table. "That is not the path for our family," she whispered in a voice so thick and cold it chilled my very bones. The air in that room was heavy with the smell of fried grease and suffocating control. I didn't scream, I didn't lunge at her, I didn't shed a single weak tear. I just quietly gathered the scraps, waited in the silent dark, carefully taped every piece of my broken dream back together, walked out of that house at 4 in the morning in the bitter winter cold, and did not return for 7 long years. When I finally walked through that front door again on a sunny afternoon 7 years later, I didn't bring anger, I didn't bring complaints or bitter tears. I brought $250,000 to absolutely shatter every toxic tradition she ever worshipped. The rules in my family had been carved into the very bricks and floorboards of that house long before I took my first breath. The eldest daughter is obligated to stay. The eldest daughter must hover around the kitchen, know how to simmer the perfect stew, quietly clean up, and raise her younger siblings. The eldest daughter must marry a local carpenter or mechanic in this dead-end town, and perpetuate the cycle of submission until the day she dies. I never dared to argue out loud. I just buried myself in my books in absolute secrecy, hiding advanced calculus textbooks under my bed and studying by the faint beam of a flashlight every single night. When that thick, pristine white envelope arrived from Boston, holding it felt like the first sweet gulp of fresh air I had ever taken after 18 years of drowning at the bottom of a deep well. Room, board, tuition, textbooks, every single cent covered by one of the greatest educational institutions on the planet. But she found it while rummaging through my drawers. She brought it down to the kitchen, and she tore it apart without blinking a single time. That act of destruction lasted exactly 7 short seconds, but its devastation was meticulously designed to imprison me, to clip my wings for the rest of my natural life. I huddled in the dark corner of my bedroom, pulling my knees tight against my chest, counting every tick of the wall clock, waiting until the entire house sank into a deathly silence. At exactly 1:40 in the morning, I tiptoed barefoot down the freezing hallway, slipped into the bathroom, opened the squeaky medicine cabinet, and found a roll of medical paper tape rolling around next to the painkillers. I brought it back to my room, turned on a flashlight the size of my thumb, and began piecing the torn edges back together. I had to hold my breath, carefully pressing the tape over the paragraph stating the scholarship amount, desperately trying to keep my trembling, sweaty fingers from smudging the crisp metallic ink. I hastily stuffed 3 faded t-shirts, a pair of frayed jeans, and a heavy winter coat into a duffel bag with a torn strap. I clutched my thick SAT prep book to my chest like a shield, and crept down the creaky wooden stairs to the ground floor. My father was awake. He was standing silently in the dark garage, holding a wrench and pretending to tinker with a rusted lawnmower that had been broken since last summer. He wasn't actually fixing anything, he was just hiding. When he saw me walk out with the duffel bag on my shoulder, he froze, his eyes avoiding mine and staring hard at the concrete floor. He quietly slipped his hand into his denim pocket, pulled 4 $20 bills from his worn-out leather wallet, and pressed them into my hand. He didn't ask where I was going in the dead of night. He didn't reach out to stop me. He just gave a slight, pathetic nod. His eyes filled with absolute helplessness. Do you know what is crueler and more mentally degrading than outright oppression? It is the silent complicity of the people who call themselves your family, the people who possess the power and the fundamental duty to protect you, but cowardly choose to stand by and watch. When my father pressed that petty cash into my hand, he thought it was a gesture of quiet love, but criminal psychology and family behavioral science call that the feeble redemption of an accomplice. He was trying to use $80 to soothe his own rotting conscience, just so he wouldn't have to walk upstairs, open the bedroom door, and directly confront the ruthless toxicity that was swallowing our home whole. Half the shadow of emotional abuse is always nurtured, enabled, and expanded by the so-called good people who choose to turn a blind eye to pure malice. I gripped that money in my freezing hand, not because I was grateful to him, but because I knew damn well it was the absolute last physical thing I could drain from his profound cowardice. I turned my back and marched out into the freezing night. The outside temperature was exactly 31 degrees. The biting north wind whipped against my skin. I walked over a mile down the pitch-black road to the town's only bus station, bought the cheapest one-way ticket heading to the East Coast, and left forever. That bus ride lasted 13 agonizing hours. I sat shivering against the freezing glass window, watching the sickly yellow streetlights and faded traffic signs blur past and get swallowed entirely by the vast darkness. My reflection in the glass looked exactly like a vagrant stranger, my eyes bruised with exhaustion but burning with a strange, fierce defiance. I had exactly $250 to my name, including my father's money. I had zero safety nets, no emergency contacts, no backup plan for failure. I only had a heavily taped college acceptance letter pressed tightly against my ribs. With every highway mile that passed, the roar of the diesel engine gave way to the deafening silence screaming inside my mind. I suddenly realized a bitter truth. My family didn't just want me to stay and act as an unpaid servant. They genuinely wanted me to fail. They desperately craved my downfall, because my success and absolute freedom would be the ultimate undeniable proof. A slap right across their faces, showing that their decades of ridiculous sacrifices and submission were completely stupid and meaningless. The city of Boston appeared before me like an entirely different universe, massive, freezing, but overflowing with opportunity. My first few days on campus, I secretly slept on a stiff vinyl couch in the student lounge for 3 straight nights before finding a financial aid advisor who actually believed my desperate situation. My freshman year, while the other kids were out partying, I registered for 18 credits a semester, bleeding myself dry from 6 in the morning until midnight. I worked 20 hours a week scrubbing test tubes and sorting chemical waste in the materials lab, and another 12 hours wiping down grime and clearing food trays in the main dining hall. My hands were chapped, peeling, and bleeding from constant exposure to cheap industrial soap. I survived on instant noodles and stale bread begged from the kitchen, but my grade point average never once slipped below a 3.8. I tried emailing my mother exactly twice during my freshman year, just to let her know I was alive, and I received absolutely 0 words in response. Her silence was as thick and cold as a block of ice. Then, in October of my sophomore year, while I was sitting in the campus library, an email from my little sister suddenly popped into my inbox. The subject line was nothing but my first name in all caps, and the body of the email contained only one single sentence, a sentence strong enough to shatter anyone's spirit. Mom told the entire parish and all our relatives that you are dead. I sat completely frozen, my eyes wide, staring at the pale blue light of the computer screen. A metaphorical funeral, a fabricated death had been smoothly staged just to save the family's rotting reputation. My sister wrote that the church priest had asked my mother where I had been lately, and my mother, with my aunt nodding in agreement right beside her, casually wiped away a fake tear and declared that I had passed away from sudden meningitis while working out of state. The fabricated tragedy of a doomed dead daughter was obviously much easier to swallow, and garnered far more pity than having to confess the humiliating truth of a living, breathing daughter who bravely refused to obey their slave labor laws. This is the absolute, most venomous peak of intergenerational trauma. Families trapped deep in toxic cycles of secret jealousy always use the facade of love and protection to mask their suffocating desire for control. In psychoanalysis and family behavioral psychology, people whose spirits were broken at a young age often have a compulsion to force and manipulate everyone around them to break too, to live the same miserable beige lives they live, just so they can feel that their own suffering and cowardice is a natural standard of society. When my grandmother gritted her teeth and gave up her youth, and then my mother accepted burying her dreams next to the kitchen sink, they brainwashed themselves and rewired their entire nervous systems to blindly believe that silent sacrifice was a supreme virtue, a woman's crown. By breaking away and rising up, by touching knowledge and existing proudly, I wasn't simply being disobedient, but in the deepest layers of their subconscious, I was betraying the very pain they had built an altar to worship for decades. If I actually achieved brilliant success, it meant their lifelong endurance was nothing but a stupid, completely meaningless choice. And their egos could never, not in a million lifetimes, forgive me for exposing that. So I decided to let them have their wish and bury me. I slammed my laptop shut, cut off all contact completely, and let the ghost of the girl named Teresa die forever in their narrow minds, while the flesh and blood Teresa spent every waking moment shedding blood, sweat, and tears to build her own tech empire right in the heart of Boston's Innovation Valley. The following years of my youth blurred by, drowned in extreme, almost obsessive focus and effort. I graduated at the top of my class, earned a full fellowship, and stayed to complete my doctorate in materials science. My relentless grind finally bore fruit when my lab secured funding and spun off into a tech startup manufacturing smart medical sensors. We worked day and night, testing constantly, and finally secured a portfolio of highly valuable patents. My equity as a co-founder began holding massive real-world value. When our series of funding round with venture capitalists closed spectacularly, the shares I held were valued at nearly $1 million on paper. I kept my minimalist lifestyle, still lived in the same cramped suburban apartment, still ate cheap home-cooked meals, but deep down, I was holding absolute power and massive financial leverage that no one in that miserable hometown could ever imagine in their wildest dreams. Then, one autumn weekend, a battered, yellowed cardboard box was left on my doorstep by the mail carrier. There was no return address, no sender's name, just a single faded postmark from my cold hometown. I dragged the box into my kitchen, grabbed a sharp paring knife and sliced through the aged packing tape. Digging through the crumpled newspaper padding, I froze when I saw my grandmother's oak recipe box. The faded box, coated in decades of old cooking grease, that had sat completely undisturbed on our family's kitchen counter for over 30 years. The scent of cinnamon, nutmeg, and rotting wood hit my nose instantly. I curiously opened the lid, and the handwritten cardboard recipe cards were still there, stacked neatly. But when my finger accidentally brushed the bottom, the loose wooden panel shifted. I carefully lifted that false wooden bottom, and lying perfectly flat, meticulously hidden underneath, was a time-worn, yellowed manila envelope. My hands trembled slightly as I slowly peeled open the flap of that ancient envelope. Inside was a high school transcript, the crisp numbers showing a 3.9 GPA, a senior class president certificate, and an acceptance letter bearing the red wax seal of the prestigious State Nursing College. The letter was typed and dated April 14, 1991. The name printed proudly on the very first line of that letter was my mother's maiden name. And staring right back at me, that letter had also been brutally torn in half right down the middle of the page. It was patched back together with a strip of medical paper tape, the exact same cheap medical tape I had used, a strip of tape that had dried out, cracked, and turned a sickly yellow after decades buried in the dark. I felt my legs go weak. I stumbled back and collapsed onto the cold ceramic kitchen tiles, sitting there for 2 straight hours without taking my eyes off that paper. I started doing the mental math. In 1991, my mother had just turned 18, the exact same age I was the night she tore my letter. Someone, almost 100% guaranteed to be my grandmother, had personally ripped her acceptance letter to shreds, severing her chance to become a professional nurse. And my mother, with the shattered heart of an 18-year-old girl, had silently wept as she taped it back together, hid it desperately under the bottom of this recipe box, and then, she chose to bow her head and stay. She raised a white flag and surrendered to fate and her family's dictation. She married my father, a man she didn't passionately love, spent the rest of her life hovering around the stove cooking the recipes from this box, and let her dream of wearing a white coat slowly rot away and turn to dust. 33 years later, she had become a flawless clone of the woman who stole her dreams. She used the exact same brand of paper tape to fix broken trinkets around the house. Right up until the fateful night she used the very hands that once tried to save her own dream to coldly rip my letter to shreds. People falsely believe that those who have tasted ultimate suffering, those who were victims of oppression, will always lean toward forgiveness and try to shield others from similar pain. But sometimes human psychology is far more twisted and cruel than that. When a person's wings are brutally and intentionally broken, when the sky is stolen from them, they become venomous and absolutely cannot stomach the sight of anyone else taking flight into the free air. She used her authority as a mother to force my head into the exact same iron cage she had been locked in, just to justify her own cowardice, weakness, and humiliating surrender at 18. That act of tearing my letter had absolutely nothing to do with protecting family traditions like she preached. It was deep-seated envy, a suffocating dark jealousy born from unfulfilled desires. She simply could not bear the thought that the daughter she birthed possessed the strength, the resilience, and the sheer courage to break free that she herself so desperately lacked. But seeing through her and understanding the root of her pain did not mean I was going to easily pat her on the shoulder and forgive the mental atrocities she committed against me. Decoding this psychological variable only gave me a razor-sharp weapon, one single advantage. I now held her fatal weakness, and I knew exactly how to collapse her entire ideology and obliterate her fake power structure. A few months after receiving the box, I got a hesitant, stuttering phone call from an unknown number, which turned out to be my father. He hesitantly informed me that my sister's 5-year-old daughter was already being led into the slaughterhouse of generational prejudice. They were buying her pink toy kitchens, constantly stuffing her head with stories about how women belong at home serving the family, meticulously paving the way for her to believe her only world existed behind a front door. Exactly like the brainwashing anthems they sang to me 25 years ago. The cycle was preparing to swallow its next victim. I could not let that happen. I gathered all my asset certificates, stuffed my crucial bank documents into a premium leather briefcase. I immediately booked a business class ticket, flying straight from Boston to Pennsylvania right on the anniversary of my grandmother's 80th birthday, the one day the entire bloodline would be gathered in one place. I parked my rented luxury SUV on the opposite corner and sat inside waiting for the perfect moment. At exactly noon, when the party reached its loudest peak, I stepped out of the car, walked straight across the lawn, pushed the heavy front door open, and marched boldly into the living room. There were about 30 relatives, from aunts and uncles to distant cousins, all crammed together, eating and laughing. The exact second my shoe touched the living room rug, the roaring laughter died instantly as if someone had pulled a plug. The room sank into a tension so thick you could hear a pin drop on the floorboards. My mother, carrying a tray of food, froze, dropping her kitchen towel onto the floor. She glared at me, her teeth grinding together, hissing threats through her teeth from the kitchen archway, ordering me to leave immediately and not humiliate the family in front of the guests. But the true power of a mature adult never lies in screaming, smashing things, or sobbing uncontrollably. If I lost my temper, screamed curses, if I yelled for justice or interrogated them about my stolen childhood, I would fall right into their trap. I would permanently remain an insolent, bitter, ungrateful, and defeated child in the eyes of those dinosaurs. Tears and empty logic can never change the rigid minds of people who have dedicated their entire lives to misunderstanding you. Silent self-control, absolute independence, and overwhelming financial dominance are the only weapons capable of crushing and locking the jaws of a room full of hypocrites. I completely ignored her threats. I didn't utter a single syllable to anyone. I took long, cold strides right past my mother, walked straight to my 5-year-old niece who was hiding behind the sofa, slowly dropped to one knee on the wool rug right in front of her, and snapped open the brass latches of my leather briefcase. I carefully pulled out my heavily taped, yellowed MIT letter and solemnly placed it on the floor right at the tips of her little shoes. I looked straight into her clear eyes, smiled gently, and said, "This piece of paper, no matter how torn and battered it is, means that somewhere out there a place respected and accepted your aunt. And I promise you there is an even bigger, more brilliant place out there, far beyond this town, that will open its doors and accept you too." Then I stood up straight, stretching my shoulders into my most confident posture. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope made of premium paper, sealed with the bright red wax stamp of a top-tier wealth management law firm in downtown Boston. I swung my arm and slammed that envelope onto the glass coffee table, the dry smack echoing sharply as the envelope slid and stopped right next to my grandmother's birthday cake. I turned to look dead in the face of my sister, who was holding her baby. I took a deep breath and spoke in a booming, articulate voice, making absolutely sure all 30 people in that room heard every single word. This is the legal documentation for an educational trust fund. A cash fund worth $250,000, fully disbursed and established exclusively for any girl in this bloodline who hungers to step foot into a university. Any boy. This massive sum is more than enough to cover full tuition at the best schools, the most comfortable housing, and all textbooks for 4 straight years. You are designated as the sole legal guardian of this fund. Total decision-making power belongs to you. And I pointed my finger directly at my sister's useless, patriarchal husband standing jaw-dropped in the corner, has absolutely zero legal standing or authority to sign a single paper to interfere with or drain this money. My grandmother, the most powerful woman in the clan, stood up abruptly, leaning her entire body weight heavily onto her carved wooden cane, her wrinkled, aged face turning from pale white to a deep, furious purple from the shock. She shakily raised her cane, struck it hard against the wooden floor, and shrieked in a high-pitched voice that the tradition for 1,000 years was that the eldest daughter must stay to serve the prosperity of the family. She screamed until her voice cracked. "Get out, take this trash paper and get the hell out of here. That is not how our family lives." I didn't blink, I slowly turned my head, moving my razor-sharp gaze straight into the depths of my mother's wide, horrified eyes. I kept my voice at a deep, profoundly still, an absolute freezing pitch, pinning every single word into her mind. "I had to use tape to fix my letter too, Mom. The exact same dry medical tape that you used for your nursing letter in 1991. The exact moment that sentence escaped my lips, time seemed to freeze. My mother's face instantly went pale as a corpse, every trace of anger evaporating, leaving behind total emptiness and absolute collapse. Her breath hitched in her throat. She took a step back, gripping the doorframe tightly. She knew exactly what that sentence meant. She knew that I had found the oak recipe box. She knew that her darkest, most agonizing secret, the absolute humiliation of her cowardice and surrender to fate that she had spent 33 years desperately burying, was now dug up and lying dead and exposed right in front of me. She no longer possessed an ounce of power to intimidate or dominate me. I didn't stand there to wait for any pathetic explanations, justifications, or belated tears from them. My objective was spectacularly complete. I turned my back and decisively walked out of that heavy wooden door, leaving behind a dead silent room. I wasn't running away like that night 7 years ago. I walked backwards with the slow, steady, and incredibly proud cadence of an absolute victor. I walked to my car, opened the door to my luxury vehicle, started the engine, and slammed the gas pedal, driving straight toward the airport without checking the rearview mirror for even a tenth of a second. Exactly 1 month after that earth-shattering event, while sitting at my desk, I received a small piece of mail sent to my Boston apartment. Inside, there was no letter from any adult, just a drawing done in messy crayons by my 5-year-old niece. A drawing of a bright red brick building, with lots of huge windows and shining sun rays, with her name written in giant letters on the roof. Tucked carefully inside that innocent drawing was my jaggedly taped MIT letter, with a neon yellow sticky note attached to the bottom corner. On the note was my sister's handwriting, writing on behalf of the little girl. "Auntie, please hold on to this paper for me. I am done using your paper. When I grow up, I will absolutely write an amazing paper of my own." Many people ask me why I did it. I realized a priceless philosophy, that forgiveness when you are standing proudly in the position of an absolute victor, holding financial power and knowledge in your hands, is never about weakly forgetting the trauma and pretending the abuse never happened. True forgiveness is the process of using your power to personally strip away all control, to shatter every toxic influence your abuser once arrogantly forced upon your mind and your life. I returned and threw down that massive amount of money not to buy their cheap, fake family affection. And I am not a shallow person trying to show off my wealth or success just to get revenge. I used that entire $250,000 like a razor-sharp sword, slashing it into the earth to draw an eternal, impenetrable boundary that absolutely no one can break. Through this direct intervention, I bought the freedom. I bought the wings for an entire next generation of women in my bloodline, personally using logic and assets to completely sever the rusted chains of intergenerational mental abuse that had taken root for hundreds of years. They have the right to keep clinging to their rotting, narrow-minded customs and traditions if they want. They can continue to delude themselves and clutch those decaying wooden boxes filled with regret straight into their graves. That is their choice. But as for me, I fought and retained my self-respect and my own brilliant future, and the proudest thing in my life is that I made absolutely sure that my little niece, and all the children to come, will also have the right to spread their wings high and keep their own vast, boundless sky. Disclaimer: this video is created for the sole purpose of entertainment. All situations, characters, and stories in this video are fictional and are built entirely using artificial intelligence technology. We hope you have a relaxing time.